So it's 12:32 GMT, and hello everyone around the world. Welcome to this COP26 side event linking air quality management to climate change mitigation. My name is Sergio Sanchez, and I am the Senior Policy Director for the Global Clean Air Initiative at Environmental Defense Fund. The objective of this side event is to make a strong call for action by COP26 to catalyze cleaner efforts around the world to simultaneously achieve climate, health, and sustainable development goals. Yesterday, we engaged in a lively conversation about what is the magnitude of the global air pollution challenge and its links to climate. And given that magnitude, what should be done to make cleaner funding commensurate to such a huge challenge? I just would like to give some highlights from yesterday's sessions. Breathing is vital. Nevertheless, for many people, it's not giving life, but shortening it. Air pollution health impacts take the life of more than 6 million people every year. The most affected are low-income communities. The cost of air pollution amounts $8.1 trillion per year, equivalent to the combined GDP of Germany, UK, and the Netherlands together. The new WHO guidelines convey a clear message. There is not a safe threshold for air pollution exposure. We are living a twin global crisis on air quality and climate change, and short-lived climate pollutants represent an enormous opportunity to save lives and mitigate climate change. There is a need for a solid analytical work prior to intervention for building effective solutions. Cost-benefit analysis is important to identify and prioritize cost-effective measures. We need data to analyze, identify cost-effective measures, and then act. Innovative technologies open new windows of opportunities for creating databases of evidence for decision-making and action. We know what to do, but we need to build commitment, leadership, public awareness, bridge the funding gap, and scale up investments. Particularly, resources are limited and difficult to allocate from government budget in developing countries. So, partners are needed to achieve goals. Funding does not match the problem. Only 1% of the development aid is addressing air quality, and it is not sustained. And international development funding is still supporting fossil fuels. To increase funding levels, air pollution should be made an explicit priority with a particular focus on low-income countries. We need to improve metrics and scientific understanding to redirect funds and report benefits, as well as to improve the accountability of our efforts. Exposure can be reduced largely, and key elements for success are data and large-scale multi-sectorial interventions in partnership with civil society and the private sector. Having said that, please join me to welcome Jessica Seddon, the Global Lead for Air Quality at the World Resources Institute, who will chair today's first session, Regional Priorities on Air Pollution for Achieving Health and Climate Benefits and Best Practices at the National Level. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergio. And I should just emphasize that regional priorities are actually global priorities. The shared interest in cleaner air for human health, for ecosystem health, for climate change, for climate stability cannot be overstated. And I think one of the sessions in this event are reiterating that. I think the other point we have is that air does not respect regional boundaries. Air moves across regions, across hemispheres, between cities and rural areas, across countries. And so in some ways, these regional priorities are very much globally shared. The thing that is not always globally shared, though, are the sources and the solutions. We have an enormous amount of variation in the sources of air pollution across and within regions. the solutions to reducing emissions vary somewhat on a technical level and often very substantially on a governance level. Which level of government is in charge? How many sectors need to be involved? How many ministries? How many agencies? How embedded can it be in national government funding? But this diversity is also an enormous source of strength. With diversity come many opportunities to experiment, to innovate, to learn from each other, most importantly. And I think I'm very excited to be chairing this panel where we have not only speakers who can discuss national action in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as in Latin America. I may interject a few points on South Asia, even though I obviously look very North American and Caucasian. I have spent about half of my professional life in India and South Asia. So I may interject a third region. We also have a discussion of how the private sector can support national action. So I don't want to take further time away from our panelists, but I do just want to emphasize the spirit of this panel is to discuss regional priorities, but most importantly, to identify ways that we can learn globally and across regions to share experiences toward this shared goal of a healthier atmosphere for people, ecosystems, and planet. So our first speaker today will be Martin Heger, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing people's last names correctly. I actually didn't have time to do the pronunciation check, who is the senior environmental economist on the environment, natural resources, and blue economy global practice at the World Bank. He comes to us with a wide range of expertise on air, climate, marine ecosystems, exactly how it should be, given how central air is to all of these different aspects of our planet. And equally impressive experience at the UNDP, European Commission, and an NGO in Panama. So over to you, Martin, and you have about 15 minutes. We'll take a few clarifying questions after your presentation and then move over to the next two panelists who I'll introduce in terms. We will have time at the end of the session to discuss all three presentations, and I would encourage all of you who are participating to think of comparative questions. But over to you, Martin, to speak about Middle East and North Africa, blue skies, blue seas. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. Yeah, I come to you, virtual people today, before you with a presentation that focuses on half of a regional report that me, along with a very competent team, has been producing. And the title of that report is Blue Skies, Blue Seas. And given today's topic on air quality and climate change, I'll be focusing on the chapters of the book that touch upon the blue skies part mostly. And as I said, it's a regional report from MENA. One last promotional pin I probably want to emphasize at this point. Looks like it will be published in January of the new year. So I'll show you the results, and please stay tuned until you can have the full book before you, virtually or physically in January. Okay, let's start. Clicking. There we go. Okay, the keyboard works better than a mouse. This is just to, the first part is mostly discussing what I would call the diagnostic part, where we look at, what's happening in MENA and how does it compare to elsewhere. And then the second part, I'll mostly talk about some of the sources and the solutions. So starting with the first part, if we look at air quality and try to get a comparative pictures of the Middle East and North Africa and put it in comparison to other regions, we see that MENA is in urban areas is the second most air polluted region following South Asia. And so before you have the plotted concentrations of particulate matter 2.5. I won't go too much into detail, but you have heard yesterday Drew and Yolanda talk about how this is arguably the most important air pollutant, at least the most consequential when it comes to health impacts. And so if we compare MENA to what used to be the WHO guideline before September of this year, we'd come to find that MENA exceeds the old WHO guideline by about 5 times. Now, the new WHO guideline for annual average PM2.5 exposure has been lowered by half. It's now 2 micrograms per cubic meter. So if we applied that new standard, we would find that MENA is in exceedance by about 10 times. If we look at the capital cities, where we have data and that report data, we find that not a single city in MENA meets the old threshold, let alone the new threshold, of course. And if we look at all other cities that are not capital cities for which we're able to source data, and we come to the same conclusion, particularly so, as I said, of course, with the new WHO guidelines. Now, air pollution and climate change. This is a schematic, and I'll provide later some more quantitative understanding as to the sources of air pollution in the Middle East and North Africa. But this is just a schematic to get sort of the cognitive juices flowing as to what we're talking about when we're talking about sources. And arguably those are the big ones that most people have on their minds. There's energy sector and the energy sector and industry on the one hand, transport, waste burning, waste management, household energy, agricultural practices. And I'm omitting dust for 1 second because all of those that I've mentioned, of course, are critical for air pollution, but they're also critical sources for climate pollution. With the exception to dust to some degree, which is more of an air pollution issue than it is a climate change issue. But this is just to sort of make the argument that, you know, reducing at source, by and large, brings benefits for both. And I'll talk a bit about the synergies later. So looking at what has been happening over the last couple of decades, we see different pictures emerging in terms of how countries, how regions have been performing on the pollution side and on the economic growth side. So the red curves before you are curves that plot the CO2 emissions per capita, and the blue curves plot gross national income per capita. And what you see in the first 2 regions on the very top, you see that Europe and Central Asia and North America, for example, over time have been managing to reduce CO2 emissions per capita. That's a good thing. And at the same time, almost continuously have improved their incomes and grown their incomes. So this is what we would call, this phenomenon we would refer to as this absolute decoupling. When we look at the second best process that can be referred to as relative decoupling, we see a whole bunch of other regions, East Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, that fall in the second category, in the category where by and large these regions have been growing in terms of income, and in terms of pollution they have also been growing or stable, but however their economic growth was faster than their pollution. When we look at Middle East and North Africa, we unfortunately see a no decoupling, where CO2 emissions per capita actually grew faster than economic growth per capita. And a similar picture emerges when we flip to the the air pollutants, of course, upholding the premise that I mentioned earlier, where it's very closely intertwined what comes out of a say a tailpipe or a factory pipe, you know. And so here, when we look at other criteria, so as pollutants, NOx and SO2, for example, we see that these graphs also plot decoupling. It's the differential in the growth rate of income and pollution. And if it is positive, as all of those bars are, then it indicates that there is decoupling happening. And if it were negative, it would indicate that no decoupling is happening, meaning that, you know, pollution growth is faster than economic growth. And what this shows is essentially that decoupling, luckily on the air pollutants, is happening in all regions, and unfortunately it's the slowest in the Middle East and North Africa region. And when we look at that important short-lived climate pollutant that we heard a lot about yesterday by Drew and Yvande, for example, black carbon, which is a very significant climate forcer, but at the same time also air pollutant. we see that, you know, there in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, it's been actually the inverse, meaning that, you know, black carbon emissions have grown faster than air pollution, than economic growth. So this is sort of to put it in perspective as to the state and the trends of what has happened regionally and why arguably MENA can be singled out. Now, when we look at the sources in the region, and we break it up by North Africa and the Middle East, which to some degree makes sense to look at the region in that dichotomous sense, we see that there's the usual suspects. Again, there's the road vehicles that contribute to pollution exposure of folks. There's waste burning on the agricultural side, but also on the municipal side, municipal waste burning. There's industrial processes. And then depending on where we look, in North Africa, agriculture has a big fingerprint in the absolute, in the pollution cocktail. And in the Middle East, you know, power plants also have a significant contribution. And then there's other sources, but these sort of are the big fish to fry, as it were. Now, why does air pollution? Because, as we heard earlier, Sergio, say globally, 6 to 7 million people per year are dying prematurely from it. And we did this also for exercise, of course, also for MENA. And in MENA, the numbers amount to about 300,000 people per year. To the left, you see a graph that I find very telling, which basically puts the risk factor, that is air pollution, to a premature life, in comparison, in context to other significant risk factors. And it turns out that, you know, air pollution alone is as consequential for premature mortality as the next 6 factors combined: road injuries, diabetes, tuberculosis, malaria, HIV/AIDS, and acute hepatitis. This is just to put the challenge in perspective of this non-communicable disease, that is. But of course, it's not just the most harsh endpoint that we could look at, which is premature mortality, but also everything in between. When we look at morbidity, diseases, keeping up with the literature over the last 10, 20 years, there's nothing that hasn't been linked to air pollution. Of course, most importantly, respiratory and cardiovascular disease, but also a whole host of other reasons and health outcomes. Richard, in the entry yesterday, has mentioned about educational achievements, lower test scores, and all that has been shown now very nicely as it relates to air quality or air pollution, as it were. City competitiveness hurts, and importantly also labor productivity. We know now from virtually every sector those studies are in existence, whether that's agricultural sector, manufacturing sector, or service sector, that folks perform less productively if they're under the influence of air pollution, especially extreme levels of air pollution. And that holds virtually, those are sort of global truths. They don't just pertain to MENA, but of course hold global truths. And recently, I was doing some research work together with Neil, Marshall Burke, and Vaibhav Rathi from Stanford University, looking at prenatal exposure in the wombs of mothers. And what we found is, as you see, unfortunately, by this upward trending linear line, I won't go into detail, but into the graph, but this is looking at data from 60 countries where we link air pollution to stunting rates, and we find that they're unfortunately strongly related, meaning that the exposure of an embryo in the womb of a mother predicts stunting rates. And for MENA, looking only at MENA, we found that about 7% of stunting, observed stunting in MENA, was linked to air pollution. And in a region with 10 million, where there's 10 million stunted children, that is significant. So this is just to further strengthen the case for air pollution. As we heard yesterday also from the WHO, it is reducing emissions is very much a health concern, and is very much a health agenda also, on top of it being a climate priority, of course. And then when we look at the costs, Sergio mentioned globally, we have $8.1 trillion annually in terms of costs from air pollution in the Middle East and North Africa. 141 billion of that befall on the Middle East and North Africa, which amounts to about 2% of regional GDP, with, of course, as this graph shows, variations from country to country. Now, arguably the most important slide and my ultimate slide is on, okay, how do we kickstart the decoupling of emissions, of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth in the Middle East and North Africa? There's a few things, and arguably we tried to prioritize hard. We think that those 5 are consequential. On the first, which arguably is the more softer part, data infrastructure needs to be improved. There is, to some degree, the Middle East and North Africa, even though I showed you some nice data endpoints and empirical studies from the Middle East and North Africa, still a lot of holes on the data production side, but also on the transparency side. And so a lot of those holes would need to be filled, and then a lot of detailed understanding on the sources of different areas. And then a dissemination of that information such that on the one hand, one builds the demand of residents and for cleaner air, and on the other hand, one gives the residents the tools to protect themselves by avoiding, especially sensitive groups, by giving them the means to avoid potential exposure. Second, and this is to not only uniquely a MENA issue, but very much a MENA issue. About half, in 2018 that was, about half of global energy subsidies was been paid out in the Middle East and North Africa. So, which basically results in a distortion of the market and an artificially favoring of dirty sources of energy, fossil fuels particularly. So the first recommendation there, of course, is to continue to reduce those insidious subsidies. And unfortunately, in COVID times, we observed some steps back, whereas countries have generally been moving in the right direction. MENA, due to COVID, we saw some steps back, and then I think it's important as we look towards green recovery in the post-COVID world that those steps are continuously taken away from fossil fuel subsidies. And then the second part is, once those fossil fuel subsidies are reduced, the next step would be, of course, to think through what are some of the pricing, carbon pricing, carbon trading, carbon market establishment tools, or pollution establishment tools, instruments that one can think about. And there's a reason for why MENA is the only region that doesn't have any fossil fuel pricing, any tax on it, or any trading scheme. It's partly because first getting rid of the subsidies, then one can look towards that. And there's been a wave of good examples recently, especially by European countries that have reduced taxes on factors such as fact of labor, income taxes, corporate taxes, in exchange for introducing pricing on carbon and pollution that one can draw from in terms of drawing inspiration as to how to do those pricing reforms. The transport sector, every city, virtually every city, that's another truism, has issues with transportation. Old fleets, fuel quality, too cheap fuel prices, etc. So they are a critical means of starting the decoupling process is to foster a modal shift from personal motorized transportation to personal non-motorized transportation, and of course public transportation. And at the same time, cleaning those modes of transportations, as it were, there's better inspection and maintenance, electrification of the respective fleets. There's end-of-pipe technology and a whole host of other things that one could do in order to spearhead that. There's a lot of things that have happened that are very successful, desulfurization in the Middle East and North Africa, but the fuel quality, better inspection schemes, a lot has happened, but just not enough. And so it's important to keep on pushing that agenda forward. Fourth, industry and energy. Here, the concoction of different instruments, on the one hand, thinking introducing tighter emission standards, but also ramping up on enforcement and compliance, introducing resource efficiency technologies and practices, and particularly on the energy efficiency side. Fuel switching and renewable energy are others. And then on the waste burning, which is still a very, very significant part, about a third of the emissions, as I showed earlier. Their solutions include, improving in solid waste management, the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. The ban of the burning and the creation of the markets for the crop residues would do wonders and kickstart the decoupling process in the Middle East and North Africa. With that, I hope I did time myself, but I didn't look at actually. Looks like I'm 2 minutes, one to 2 minutes over. So apologies for that, Jessica. So thank you.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. Actually, the slide was great, and I could see the chat coming alive as you were going through the slides. So I no problem at all. So I think actually, in even looking at this slide, in my earlier point about diversity across regions and solutions, as I look at this slide, it looks pretty universal. These specific solutions and the specific ways to, say, create a market for crop residues may vary between, say, North India and the Middle East and North Africa, but still common shared problems. So, in that spirit, I had one question, and while we're gathering questions from the audience, one clarification. You mentioned this improve and better disseminate air pollution information, and I was struck early on by it may have been a side remark that you said, in many capital cities, the cities that actually monitor air pollution, which implies there's a lot where it's not monitored. We have data. I'm assuming that we have enough data to know where to start. That seems pretty clear from your presentation. If you were investing in the next round of air pollution information across monitoring, emissions inventories, models, anything, where would you put that investment to get the maximum actionable information? What are your thoughts on the more data question?
Right. So with air quality data and data in general, I think one doesn't have to be that picky, because it's compared to the costs of the problem, it's peanuts. It doesn't cost that much. I mean, it's not nothing, but it's certainly, it pales in comparison to the benefits of that information. Just the information of folks to better protect their health. So a few things. On the one hand, there is an issue of many cities not doing the monitoring at all. So of course I showed a picture of where we monitor, and in some other instances we had to infer from more disruptive technology types, like satellite information and other products, but which are just not as good as, say, regulatory grade air quality monitoring stations. So that is to say, on the one hand, where there are these black holes of cities, including capital cities in the Middle East and North Africa, investment in the 101 of air quality monitoring, regulatory grade monitoring stations. That's one. Another one is investing in understanding the sources better. So there's source apportionment studies that ought to be supported, and emissions inventorying work on the other side, so to continuously push that agenda. And then a third, and that's more en vogue, and that fits very well with the theme that we have today and yesterday, and Yvonne and Drew mentioned that a lot, short-lived climate pollutants. We're only catching on, not only in MENA, but globally, on better measuring some of those short-lived climate pollutants with ethylometers and other devices. So, getting a better grasp of where are the black carbon emissions, how do they compare, and methane emissions, that would do wonder. And then fourthly, I would say some places measure, but they don't make data available, and then sort of defies a huge part of the benefit of having that measurement. So there, I would argue, on the data transparency side of things, there could be a lot of very valuable push to be made.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things in the Clean Air Catalyst is a big focus is building what we call source awareness, which is a shared understanding of sources beyond the source attribution or the source apportionment studies, how to build a shared understanding, trust, and ability to distinguish between what seems like, one pie chart says transport, another pie chart says industry. How do you distinguish as a consumer of this information? What are the sources that people should be supporting their policymakers to act on? There are some questions coming up in the chat, and I think your point on the cost of investing in information is peanuts compared to the benefits is in some ways getting at the where to spend your money. I noticed, so Peter S in the chat had I thought quite a good question. Are there any examples where the governments have been reluctant to act, but the World Bank has been able to coax and encourage them? And I would add one more phrase to that, which you brought up, which is the coincidence between air quality and climate action. Do you see that convergence of air quality and climate benefits from the same set of actions being a source of strength? And if so, how would or could the World Bank invoke that or leverage that to accelerate clean air and climate action?
Yeah. So on the first, helping along and sort of the nudging of regional and national governments to monitor and then make the data available. I think that has been one of our core roles, and to some degree we've been pushing that through the pollution, fostering that through the pollution management and environmental health program, but also before that program was alive. On the one hand, supporting governments with monitoring and capacity around it, the monitoring, but also then making sense of the data, and then showing them the upshots of making data available. Partnering, especially with our ministries that are most concerned with air quality, as it were, ministries of health, ministries of environment, and basically, switching the conversation a bit from a blame game, which is why oftentimes it's politics why certain entities do not want to make data available. But if you shift it from a blame game to this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to reduce these huge costs that Sergio was mentioning. And $7 trillion a year is peanuts. These are huge costs, and this is just on the air quality side, not even factoring in the climate change benefits, right, of abating. So if one turns it around and makes it about these are the huge economic opportunities that you can be part of the solution, I think that goes a long way in shifting it from a blame game conversation. It's the manufacturers of whatever in Germany, the car manufacturers, or it's the agricultural waste burning that happens in Punjab or whatever, in pointing the finger, but rather phrasing it as opportunity. That does wonders. And on the second question, I do think that that those two agendas are joined by the hip, the climate mitigation agenda, that is a global public good, and the air pollution reduction agenda, which is a regional, more localized public good. And almost virtually everything under the sun is good for both things. Not everything, and I think Gregor later will talk a bit about how in particular the different instruments factor on the air pollution reduction side and on the climate change reduction side, but almost virtually everything that you do that helps with one helps with the other. And I think to make that joint case forcefully in whatever fora, that this isn't just a public service you're doing to someone else in some other country by mitigating climate pollution, but also very much gives you very real benefits locally at home, because your own citizens, all residents are no longer less ill, less missing work days, all those good things. Your kids are falling in less. I think that these two agendas should be joined by the hip, and I don't see why they wouldn't be, especially because they're so complementary.
And I mean, in the end, it's one atmosphere that we have, and the chemistry matters for almost anything. In fact, everything we care about. So I especially like the phrasing of a shared opportunity. There is a question in the chat about the marginal cost of marginal cost of preventing death from air pollution. I'm going to actually put that into the common question session at the end, because I think it's probably not as regionally specific. And I also think that Martin had really made the case that it's really quite low when you think about all the benefits that come from pollution reduction. I want to actually move to the next speaker, Jordi, just to make sure we have time for all the regional presentations, and then we'll come back to all three panelists at the end. Jordi Pon is the regional coordinator for chemicals, waste, and air quality for Latin America Office of the UN Environmental Program. Prior to UNEP, he has a long history in research and environmental consulting. So really trying to bring this science to bear on action, on pollution, waste management, all of these things that we're talking about, with a focus on Latin America. Over to you, Jordi, and 15 minutes, 5-10 minutes clarifying afterwards about Latin America, and then we will move to the Eleni and the private sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for the invitation to be here today, presenting the perspectives and trends from Latin America and the Caribbean. Just let me confirm that you can see the slides.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I was listening very, very attentive and closely to the presentation from Martin and the regional perspective from MENA, because indeed, and as Jessica was mentioning, there are some global connections and some potential solutions that and sources of the problem that are really common, but specific at the same time to some of the regions. And that's the value of this sharing exercise. In Latin America and the Caribbean, from this presentation, I would like just to provide a brief background and regional context, as in the previous presentation, but quickly move to understand how the region is taking action on this agenda based on some recent assessments that UNEP has conducted at global and regional level. I would also like to share with you how the region is taking this air quality topic into the regional agenda as a region, and just a few examples on how some countries are linking the air quality agenda with climate change. And I would like to conclude with some reflections on challenge and opportunities. Well, as a background, I think that you have already listened yesterday and today to the significance of the impact of air pollution at different levels, but that can be summarized also as an indicator on what is the level of cost and impact in the GDP. Similarly to MENA, in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is as an average about 2.4% of the GDP, the cost of air pollution. One specificity of Latin America and the Caribbean is that this is one of the most urbanized region in the world. It's above 80% of the population is living in urban zones. We know that urban and metropolis, that there are quite a few in Latin America, are the places where air pollution creates the major impacts and where the people is mostly exposed. It means that in our region, more than 150 million people lives in areas exceeding the WHO guidelines. the former guidelines. So I'm pretty sure that it's much more according to the guidelines that were released last month of September. What are the drivers? What are the main sources in our region? Similarly to other regions and globally, you can see here the main drivers, the main sector. In terms of energy production and energy, the Latin America and the Caribbean region has steadily been increasing the power demand. This is and it is projected to expand as an average of annual rate of 2.2%. As you saw in the presentation of Martin, this growing has not been decoupled. So this is one of the lowest, I was looking at that, this is one of the lowest rates of decoupling between economic growth and industrial development and pollution. So this is something to be considered for this region, which has growth economically without decoupling at the same pace. Road transport, this is again, Latin America is one of the highest, has one of the highest motorization rates, and the annual growth of motorization is quite fast. It's about 5%. Annually. Waste management and open burning is another issue. It's every day more than 100 million tons are produced, and we estimate, and this is growing because of population growth, but particularly because of the increase in the waste generation per capita, because of the lifestyles. Again, the pace of increasing and strengthening the waste management systems is not fast enough. We estimate that about 30%, one-third of the waste still are end up in dump sites. So open burning is taking place, and we have identified more than 10,000 dump sites in the Latin American and the Caribbean region. So there is a lot of work to do also on waste. Residential cooking and heating is also an important source of pollution, particularly indoor pollution. Where about 90 million people in Latin America rely on solid fuels for cooking, which is about 15% of the total population. And finally, agriculture and forestry, agricultural burning and wildfires are also two large sources of air pollution in the region. This is a little bit of the overview of main sources. So what we focus the last 2 years is to update what are the actions that countries, what are the progress that countries have been conducting on the air quality agenda. This was an effort mandated by the UN Environment Assembly a few years ago. So it was done at global level, and in each region we have this kind of assessment, and it was released last month of September. So we covered in the region the situation of the 33 member states. We focus on the main anthropogenic sources that have been just mentioned. And basically we collected data with the baseline of 2020 with a detailed survey that was shared with all these countries. And we have the information from 20 countries that represents more than 90% of the population in the region, and focusing on the major air pollutions that have impact on public health, particularly PM 2.5, ozone, and other precursors. So in summary, where is the LAC region taking action in the different sectors? We can see that a number of countries have taken measures in relation to energy efficiency, in enforcing emission standards, and also in promoting incentives for clean production. However, there is not a much growth or change or progress in this indicator, but there are some level of action in relation to industry and energy production. In relation to transport, there has been some progress, but still many countries do not have vehicle emission standards. About 9 countries have already suitable emission standards, and others that are progressing in this line. As mentioned, waste burning, that is another important issue in the region. There has been some progress, but still there are some countries that strictly regulate this, others that have provisions to regulate but are not actually being enforced enough. The issue of household energy, there are a number of countries that have also taken measures, particularly those that where this issue is more prominent, but the change in the number of actions has not progressed a lot in the last, at least in the last 4 or 5 years. But we have very good examples across the region. According to the information that we do have, there are also a number of countries that are taking action on sustainable agriculture, in the, for instance, in the management of livestock waste or sustainable practices to minimize emissions from these sectors. Also, from the responses that we do have, we see that that more countries have increasingly deployed monitoring networks, but the geographic and the space and temporal scope is still quite limited. There's still significant gaps, so data and information still relies on modeling rather than on actual data in many places, including some large cities. But there have been some positive developments also on this. Relation to air quality management, we have some countries that already have comprehensive national, subnational, and sectoral management strategies, but a number of countries are still working on them or updating, or have not yet this kind of strategies. And finally, when we look at the adoption of air quality standards, we see that about more than 20 countries have standards embedded into the legal instruments, but it also means that about 1/3 of the countries do not have legal standards, and those that have legal standards will need to be possibly revised, or now will be significantly higher than the new WHO guidelines. Well, moving on and just looking at some examples, for some indicators, we were also looking at what were the progress. We have, for instance, what has been the progress against the baseline year, that is 2015, in relation for the Euro 4 vehicle emission standard. We have seen some progress, some positive progress. As you can see, in 2020 we have more countries, 9 countries in the green section, but still there is a lot of room to move. In relation to solid waste burning regulations, again, some progress. So the region is advancing, there is progressing, but overall there is still significant gaps. And as mentioned, ambient air quality standards, we identified 2 additional countries that had adopted, and we have identified some of them that are updating these standards. This is a summary of the number of countries that we have identified that have some level of actions in the different indicators that I just mentioned. So you will see here in the presentation. I will move on due to time constraints. So now I would like to present you about the regional agenda. In Latin America and Caribbean, and I understand that as in many other regions, we do not have legally binding framework, or comparing to other agendas like climate change or chemicals, we don't have an agreement, international or regional agreement, stating provisions for the countries on air pollution. And this is something that there's living a lot of discussions considering the transboundary nature of air pollution, but we have some platforms and some instances that are important ones to set priorities in the environmental agenda, like for instance the Forum of Ministers of Environment that has been in place for the last 40 years. Air quality has been in the agenda of the forum since more than 15 years. And proof of that is that by 2004 and 2008, a regional network, like a community of practice and a common endeavor to address air quality was established. During the last years, the activity of this network was diminished but in the last Forum of Ministers, at least this year in February 2021, it was very important decision on pollution, which has a specific section on atmospheric pollution, where the governments, where the ministers of environment at this high level invites the Secretariat UNEP to establish this atmospheric pollution network, request the network to update the regional action plan. There was already a national action plan some years ago, and to prepare a resource mobilization strategy to address this problem. Also, in parallel, it calls to promote the development of initial information exchange and capacity building actions, considering this is an important gap and necessity on some priorities for the region, and also calls UNEP and the Interagency Technical Committee of the Forum, where the World Bank, the IDB, UNDP, ECLAC, several organizations are there, where there is a call for them to support on a number of issues like low-cost ambient air quality monitoring and the development of air quality pollution control policies. And there is a recognition of the linkages with the work on climate change. So the governments are quite clear on these linkages. So according to this mandate, during this year, we have reestablished this network. We already have more than 20 countries that have designated focal points, the directors of air quality, the people that are in charge of this agenda in the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean. So we have a wealth of expertise in this network. We have 7 governments that have a direct guide the network through an steering committee that is chaired by Peru and Colombia. And we have started to organize regional events for promoting information and good practices. This has been very successful. So we realize that there is an important appetite for this, because in the 3 events that we have organized, it was joined by more than 800 participants from the health and the environment sectors and other sectors in these regional events. And the next one is tomorrow, actually. You're kindly invited, and we'll be focusing on household energy. But the most important, the main mandate that we have now is to update the air quality regional action plan. So what is going to be the agenda? What is the agreement between the region about the priorities and the cooperation actions for at least for the next 4 years, but with a vision towards the 2030. This is under development. We need to conclude this by end of this year before submission to the Forum of Ministers early next year. These are the building blocks of this air quality action plan. The key actions on air quality management and emission reduction that countries and cities should be considering in the coming years are defined in the action plan to address on a cross-cutting way to all the sectors that you can see below. And then a number of regional cooperation actions and technical assistance are being defined with the dialogue and identification and taking into consideration the baseline with the countries for the next 4 years. And also it will be very important to define the strategic partners, the alliances, also resource mobilization strategy, and finally accompanying and monitoring and assessment of this regional action plan. Then just to conclude, also I wanted to show you some examples in the region where this connection has already been established. For instance, we have 3 countries here like Mexico, Chile, and Colombia that, for instance, have already included black carbon mitigation commitments in their NDC that have already been submitted. They have produced the inventories. They have included black carbon in the inventories. And for instance, we have Mexico, which has included a 51% reduction of black carbon emissions by 2030, according to the baseline of 2013, and includes measures on transport, power generation, oil, gas, industrial waste, residential, and agriculture sector. Similarly, Chile has included a 25% reduction target by 2030 in number of sectors as well, and Colombia a 40% reduction target by 2030 with a focus on the replacement of open fire stoves, the cleaner production in the bricks industry, electromobility, and address also the production of panela, that is the concentrated sugar cane juice. We are also working UNEP with support from the US Department of State. We have some global projects, and in the region we are supporting some countries to strengthen the monitoring and the development of air quality strategies in countries and cities. We have started working with Costa Rica and Peru with several components. So a component on strengthening air quality monitoring, so that will inform and will also enable us to develop strategies and action plans to prevent and reduce air pollution. Through this project also several tools are being developed, and we have an important component on regional dissemination and tools on good practices to upscale the impact of all this process. We also have here the opportunity in developing these strategies to link air pollution and climate change mitigation in these strategies, because this is also a clear vision of the countries. So I would just like to summarize some of the priorities that we are observing in the region. This relates with air quality continuous automatic monitoring. We need to increase the temporal and spatial coverage. We need more information for many reasons that have been mentioned, for comparison, for assessment of the measures that are being implemented, and to design the new policies. Also, strengthening the institutional and technical capacity to implement and enforce air quality agendas. The development of coherent and integrated policy and regulatory frameworks. This is a continued task, and to adopt ambient and update air quality standards. Very importantly, the development of action plans and roadmaps with key stakeholders in different sectors, including private sector, scientific advisor, civil society, and in the most polluting sectors towards a better air quality management. And also develop and regularly update emission inventories. There is a lack of information also of comparative inventories among countries, and there is some gaps there. But some other emerging needs and challenges that have been mentioned by the governments is the need to address air pollution from forest fires and wildfires. That is an emerging problem in the region. This creates also transboundary air pollution, and this is not properly addressed in the region. But some opportunities, we think that regional cooperation is a key opportunity in the region, and we have some platforms and some mechanisms to promote this. Also, because there are some countries that have a long run in this, we also have high technical capacities in the region. So we have 10 centers, we have experts in the region that can deliver, can advise the countries. New alternative technologies, for instance, for monitoring, like low-cost sensors combined with great sensors is something that can be considered. And the synergies with other environmental and health agendas, it's a key of major importance, for instance, for the development of integrated emission inventories. I'll leave it here, Jessica. Sorry if I took more time. I'm not there.
all of my usual moderation tricks of the kind of the glare and the standing up just don't work on Zoom. But as you know, as with you we're getting to the regional examples and to the challenges and opportunities and priorities, which I think are probably what's on everybody's mind. So you know, the strategic placement of those kinds of slides in the overage is good. I think given the time, and I think that we want to make sure that we do have a chance to hear from Eleni on supporting the private sector. There is one question that has come up for both you and Martin from Peter among the participants about how do we shift the incentives for farmers to reduce agricultural burning, which is a common pollution source across the two regions. And so I just wonder if we could go back to, if you wanted to take that question, Jordi, and then we can come back to Martin to talk about, whether what might work in Latin America might also work in the Middle East and North Africa. Though before we do that, though, I do want to just highlight for all of the participants that there are a number of different reports that are being shared in the chat. So there's an enormous amount of information, not just about what the panelists are speaking on, but additional reports and information that may be helpful both globally and regionally. So over to you, Jordi, on this question about agricultural burning and farmer incentives. And then we'll come back to you, Martin, on that.
Thank you. Yeah, this is something that there is not one single solution, but we have some good examples. For instance, in Brazil, they are producing having a national policy with incentives on this sector is something that I would advise to start with in order to recognize the specificities of each sector, how the agriculture sector is organized, and which are the main stakeholders. We have some examples in Brazil, for instance, where they have a low carbon agriculture plan, where there are a number of measures that can be considered, and also the NAMAs are also an instrument that can be taken into account. For instance, Costa Rica has a NAMA for coffee production, and there are other countries in South America that have been developing NAMAs for livestock management. So these are some of the instruments, or at least the framework, the enabling frameworks that can help the sector to progress in reducing the emissions. And also in the past, the UNEP had made some, the agricultural waste is huge, is massive, but it's not so visible like some other municipal waste. And at the same time, this is a waste stream that has a high value in some cases, like in sugarcane, and there is an important potential of recovery of this waste. So I think there is a strong potential for valuation of agricultural waste and good practices out there. That is by sharing these good practices, I think there is a lot that can be done. But the agriculture sector needs to see is a sector that needs to see the examples. You need to take them to see how does it work in the other farm. This is a sector that has not a lot of investment capacity, so it is important to show them the good case studies. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean also to create, just if you think of the challenge with rice stubble burning in northern India, there's also the creation of infrastructure to enable the aggregation, transport, and use of waste. It's not all just about the farmers. It's about, in some ways, the context and the background. Martin, do you have thoughts on this question of how to change the incentives for agricultural waste burning from a MENA perspective?
Yeah, you guys talked about all the right things already. From the MENA side, the example I like to give is really Egypt, where the country had what was called the black cloud phenomenon, which every October and November, when the harvest season ends, rice stubbles and wheat stubbles were burned. Such that it was easier than to plow the fields again. And that led to significant increases in pollution concentrations, much like India. Similar story to India and several other places, except that arguably a bit less in terms of intensity as say India. And I'm thinking about the Indo-Gangetic Plain here. And what now that the black cloud is gone. Virtually, not entirely, but virtually in Egypt. Extreme, amazing success. And what has worked was a combination of things. Some of those you touched upon. And the carrot and the stick. On the stick side of things, there was a monitoring system established where, in the situation room, folks in the Ministry of Environment, it was able to know exactly when a fire was burning. They detected with satellites the smoke, right? At the same time, the police got the mandate to clamp down. The police had the mandate to also impose fines and other penalties. So that on the one hand, right? And then the carrot on the other hand, where farmers were helped with some of that infrastructure you mentioned, Jessica, where they, because it's sort of a collective action problem, where farmers may gather rice husk, but then what do they do with it? They sit on it and it takes up space on the fields, etc. So the ministry also set up a collection and actually also buyback and monetary incentives, where they offered, forget the exact amount, but they offered per bushel per ton the farmers compensation for that rice husk. And now the plan, the critical last end of that value chain is what to do with it, right? So to create a sustainable flow and create a market for this rice husk. And that is now the last component, which is waste to energy. That one is still flourishing in Egypt, but that is sort of the cherry on top to round it off, to also create a marketable resource of something that wasn't before. So, yeah.
I think that's actually, I mean, I think the thing that we all have to remember is that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, all right, I'm going to go give some kids some asthma and cause some premature deaths today. That an enormous amount of pollution comes from people doing what is they need to do to move around, to cook, to produce, to farm. And those choices, we have to motivate them to be different. And often, for much of the world, we need to enable them to be different. And that taking that perspective of looking at, as you said, Martin, the whole value chain, the whole set of root causes and decisions and why those decisions are made is incredibly important in getting to solutions that can actually stick. So with that, I think that creates a very nice segue to introduce our last panelist, Eleni. And Eleni, I have to apologize. I probably am going to butcher your last name, Michalopoulou. Was I in the ballpark? No. Michael? Anyway.
That's absolutely fine. Don't worry.
But Eleni is a member of the Stockholm Environment Institute Air Pollution Group, where she focuses on working on national action planning for short-lived climate pollutants. And she was a co-author on the IPCC's 2019 refinement of the national GHG inventories, and also has been working on developing a guideline and framework for private sector emission reduction, focusing on air pollution. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about that. And also, Eleni, if in your presentation, you maybe could pick up where Martin left off with this point of creating incentives all along the value chain to change the decisions that interrupt emissions, rather than simply saying, let's ban them and let it all trickle backwards. So over to you, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we can start sharing my slides. Oh, thank you very much. Great, fantastic. Thank you. So yes, as Jessica said, what I will be discussing with you today is this initiative that comes in two parts, actually. Well, and overall, the title of the presentation is Supporting the Private Sector in Achieving Short-Lived Climate Pollutant Reductions, but actually I will be talking about all of the air pollutants, or most of the air pollutants. And perhaps we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm very certain that the impacts of air pollution are really well known among people that participate in these kinds of discussions, but I think it's still important to highlight a couple of things when it comes to the impacts of air pollution. So overall, human health and lives, clean air is a human right and a priority. And this should always be our first thought when discussing air pollution. Because air pollution is the largest environmental risk to public health today. It harms human health, human well-being, it reduces the quality of life. People are exposed to air pollution in their workplace, during travel, in their homes, and this exposure to indoor and outdoor air pollution, in fine particulate matter, causes an estimated 7 million premature deaths every year, according to WHO. But it is also responsible for acute and chronic disease. So things like increased risk for ischemic heart disease, stroke, and other dangers to human health are all exacerbated in the presence of air pollution. There are also economic impacts of air pollution. Polluted air has huge economic costs. So, for example, in 2016 alone, from outdoor air pollution, the global cost of health damages was estimated to be $5.7 trillion US, which was the equivalent to 4.8% of the GDP that year. So addressing air pollution can have substantial economic benefits because air pollution has huge impact, has huge economic costs related to human health, lost productivity, reduced crop yields, and reduced competitiveness of globally connected cities. Next slide, please. Finally, and before we move into the core of the presentation, I should also highlight that air pollution and its impacts are also a matter of equity, because although the entire population is affected by air pollution, the distribution of disease burden is inequitable because it is influenced by income levels, access to nutrition, underlying disease among the poor, AIDS, gender, among other things. So this impacts also disproportionately the most vulnerable people and communities. Now, that final bullet point on this slide, I found extremely interesting because the state of global air mentions that 20% of newborn deaths worldwide were attributed to air pollution. So this creates an intergenerational justice issue. So this was extremely interesting to see in that context as well. Now, that last point says climate change, because in the next slide, if we can go to the next slide, I think it is pretty much the core of the presentation, but also the discussion in the panel today. So air pollution and climate change are very strongly linked. All major air pollutants have an impact on the climate, and most share common sources with GHGs, especially related to the combustion of fossil fuels. But they also interact with each other in multiple ways. For example, if we take methane, which contributes to the formation of a ground level ozone, and then the levels of the ground level ozone increase with rising temperatures. But then the rising temperatures will increase the frequency of wildfires, which in turn will further elevate the levels of particulate air pollution. If we look at the short-lived climate pollutants, the SLCPs, which are highly potent climate forcers, and in the case of ozone and black carbon, dangerous air pollutants, we will see that many SLCP reduction measures can also reduce other pollutants. And this is quite an important point, and it's directly linked to the third point of this slide, because the interlinkages between air pollution and climate change, what actually give us is an opportunity to amplify the benefits of our actions and catalyze even greater mitigation ambition. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I'm just very mindful of the time. So in terms of the business's contribution to air pollution, now private sector activities contribute to the emissions of air pollutants and SLCPs. However, the magnitude of these emissions and the contribution of the different stages of the value chains are typically not quantified or tracked. In this slide, we can see examples of sources of emissions that may be present within the business's activities, which include the burning of fossil fuels and biomass in electricity generation, transport, industry and buildings, industrial processes and solvent use, such as chemical and mining industries, but we can also see agriculture and waste. Now, what was previously mentioned in the beginning, it was a very interesting point made by Jessica about the regional and the global, and this interaction of the regional and the global. A very interesting recent study analyzed the international trade patterns and calculated the air pollutant emissions emitted in one region and the production of goods and services that were consumed in another region. Now, this study concluded that over 700,000 premature deaths per year were attributable to air pollution exposure that resulted from air pollutant emissions in one region that were associated with these goods and services consumed in another region. So far, a few companies have quantified the air pollution emissions that are emitted by the virus activities and processes within their value chains. And this makes identifying the most effective actions to control the emissions quite difficult. But, and I think this is a nice point to lead us into the next slide, greenhouse gas emissions are often quantified as part of a company's sustainability trackers, for example. Thank you very much. So on this slide, on the right-hand side, we can see the air quality management cycle from the US EPA, but also the EMEPA air pollution guideline that I will be talking about in just 1 minute. What I wanted this slide to convey is that what we need in terms of businesses and air pollution is a plan. We need an integrated approach. And the starting point for going about our approach is, of course, to quantify air pollution emissions. But in order to do that appropriately, we need this to be harmonized with greenhouse gas methodologies, so the existing ones, for example. We then need to establish goals, and these goals need to be the outcome of multi-stakeholder discussion and consultation. We need to determine emission reductions, and these need to be both feasible but ambitious as well. We need to develop appropriate strategies, and these need to be impactful, and they need to be strongly supported by the different stakeholders. We need to implement programs, and in these programs, we need both leadership but also knowledge exchange, both very critical in the implementation. And finally, what we need is ongoing evaluation, because this allows us, considering this in advance, allows us to avoid unintended consequences. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So what we can see here is what happens on the national level. And then I find this matrix very interesting because, at the top of it, we see that on the national level, methodologies and guides to estimate emissions of different pollutants and greenhouse gases include national emission inventory guidebooks produced by the IPCC. And of course, include, in terms of air pollution, they include the inventory produced by the EMEPA. But these are for the national level. If we look at businesses and value chains, what we have in terms of tools is, for the private sector, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides guidance and templates and methods specifically designed to quantify greenhouse gas emissions. So then we noticed that there was this hole, there was this gap. We didn't have a tool to estimate air pollution from businesses. And we needed something that would align with this matrix. We needed something that would make sense. As I mentioned earlier, there is a large overlap in greenhouse gas and air pollutant emission sources. But this also means that there is substantial overlap between the methods and the data needed to quantify emissions from greenhouse gases and air pollutants. So this created an excellent opportunity to develop this tool that could do just that. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the air pollution emission inventory guide for businesses, it was pre-launched on the 3rd of November during COP26. and it is a collaborative project between the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, so that's the CCAC, IKEA, and the Stockholm Environment Institute. This guide has three main aims, and that is to develop practical guidance for businesses to quantify emissions of air pollutants across their value chains. And I will be giving some more detail about that. For the guidance to be consistent with methods currently used for GHG reporting, and to apply the guidance across a range of companies in order to ensure that it is appropriate, practical, and useful for the reporting. So, and just one more comment on this point, it is not the intention of this guide to become something that someone listens about it and they think, oh no, this is just one more thing we need to do. It needs to be something that is easy, it needs to be an add-on, and it needs to be very, very practical. Next slide, please. Thank you. I would just quickly like to mention what the guide includes. As you can see here, we have the different air pollutants, the short-lived climate pollutants, and the greenhouse gases. However, the guide at this stage includes specifically PM 2.5, PM 10, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, organic carbon, and carbon monoxide. We will be working on the guide to add to this. But this is the current, the basket of air pollutants and short-lived climate pollutants that we are looking at. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I think this is one of the very exciting slides because it shows the process, the framework that we have developed in order for a company to be able to follow this guide and estimate air pollution across their value chain. And we have developed this 6-step process, which starts with a company mapping their value chain. And in most cases, most companies will have already done that, especially those that are already reporting on their greenhouse gases or have different sustainability trackers. The second step allows for the company to identify the sources within the different stages of the value chain, and then they can identify the methodologies, the appropriate methodologies to quantify their emissions. And of course, in the guide, steps 4 and 5 are about identifying the appropriate data, identifying and or collecting the appropriate data and emission factors, and then finally applying those methods to quantify the emissions. Next slide, please. Again, this is the other slide that I find extremely exciting. And the reason for that is because what we've done is that we've taken the generic stages of a value chain, as you can see. Hopefully you can see those letters are way too small for me. Starting from raw material to manufacturing to distribution and storage and transport, then retail, in use of the product, and then end of life. And what we have done is we have identified the key sources of pollution within those generic stages of the value chain. Those key sources of pollution are then, they also have the appropriate methodologies in the guide. So as you can see, they correspond to specific sections. So you go through all the sources of pollution across the stages of the value chain, and this allows for the user to quantify air pollution using this guide. I should say, before we change the slide, I should say that the 6 sources of pollution that are identified in this guide are electricity generation, stationary fuel combustion, transport, which includes off-road vehicles, freight and passenger transport, the industrial processes, agriculture, and waste. Next slide, please. So since this guide is very newly launched, and since we are aiming to get as much feedback as possible, I would just like to show you the timeline for the guide. So the plan is that the first draft will be produced and disseminated for review by the end of this month. And then what we will do is we will open a review process. So the different interested businesses can review the guide, and other expert groups, of course, they can review the guide and provide feedback. We will then close the review period and finalize the guidance. And then the final guidance will be released during August 2022. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in the earlier slides, what we needed was an integrated plan, and the first step of that plan was to quantify air pollution. But that plan, that approach, it had more steps. So I would like to link the content of that slide with something extremely exciting that happened also on the 3rd of November during COP26. And that was that the World Economic Forum launched the Alliance for Clean Air. So a year ago, in October 2020, the World Economic Forum started a new Global Future Council, the Global Future Council on Clean Air. And the Alliance for Clean Air is one of the outcomes of this council. And it's an extremely important outcome because, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, there are 10 founding members. There are 10 companies that launched the Alliance for Clean Air, including Accenture, Maersk, Biogen, Bloomberg, Google, IKEA, the Mahindra Group, and so on. And the founding members of the Alliance will establish air pollution footprints on nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxide, particulate matter within 10 months. They will pinpoint where those are being emitted to track human exposure. They will set ambition targets and objectives to reduce the air pollution emissions with a clear action plan. And they will act as champions to promote and raise awareness on air quality and use their assets innovatively to accelerate clean air solutions. So the reason why I am showing this slide specifically is because it is this type of alliance, coalition initiative that can give life to the other parts, to the other stages of that integrated approach. We needed, and it was, very, very much needed, this leadership and buy-in from the companies in order to put air pollution into their agendas, really, really high and really clearly. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And I'm very close to the end now. Thank you. So developing integrated and appropriate mitigation pathways is extremely important because, these plans and strategies to rapidly reduce warming, they must integrate actions to reduce all air pollutants and greenhouse gases that contribute to long and short-term climate impacts. Having integrated approaches can maximize the benefits, it can reduce the costs, it can reduce the risk of policy failure, and it can deliver both strategic but also development priorities. And again, this also goes back to Jessica's initial point on the regional and the global. We can take cost-efficient actions to maximize the impact with reduced effort and resources. So this systemic and integrated approach can address a lot of problems at the same time and achieve a lot of sustainable development goals at the same time. Finally, and this is not an unimportant point, these integrated approaches, they address multiple consumer concerns at the same time. And if we can go to the final slide, please. I would just like to highlight, overall, by addressing air pollution and climate change at the same time, we are not only going towards achieving the Paris targets and the Paris Agreement, but we are also saving lives. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleni. And I just want to emphasize one additional point on Eleni's presentation about this incredibly exciting business alliance, as well as the actual guidelines for making a real change, is that it's not often known, but pollution footprints are actually expanding faster than GHG footprints. And the level of inequity between the places where consumption happens and the places where pollution related to that production for the consumption holds across countries, it holds within countries. And there are, there's kind of a blossoming of studies that are showing really very, very striking results that make this point about global and regional. You cannot clean up local clean air or regional clean air by moving your pollution elsewhere. And I think this kind of supply chain, full behind the scenes accounting is just incredibly powerful. And I'm very excited to be part of this Global Futures Council along with Eleni on this. And so thanks for that presentation, Eleni. The one, I just want to close because we're actually at 9 o'clock right now. And I know that it's morning, afternoon, evening, everybody needs a break. Zoom is Zoom. And we also have a short video to play during the presentation. With one point, and I just want to circle back to the unifying feature across all of these presentations, which was, the facts on the impact of air pollution, the facts on what we can do right now with money we have, powers we have, technology we have. To me, it's inexplicable that we're not acting faster. And I think the time has come when we are increasingly well able to communicate this, when there's a heightened awareness of the air that we breathe and the air that we share. And the moment is really now to do better for this, very fragile one atmosphere that we all share. So thank you to the panelists, thank you to the participants, and thank you most of all actually to the World Bank and to the co-organizers of this session for giving us all the chance to talk about this. For those participating, there's an enormous amount of information in the chat. And I think, as always, all of us on the panel, I'm not going to volunteer the other panelists. If there are other follow-ups, if there's anything you see that you want to talk about further, we're easy to find. And as you can tell from, I think, all of our faces and body language, this is what motivates us professionally and personally. So thank you very much. And back to you, Sergio.
Thank you very much, Jessica, Eleni, Jordi, and Martin. And now we are going to take a very short break. And while you enjoy your coffee, you are invited to watch a video from our partners showing their work. So let's reconvene in 5 minutes, let's say 9:07, to start our panel 2. Thank you so much.
Air pollution is choking people and cities around the world at alarming rates. Globally, 9 out of 10 people breathe unhealthy air. Air pollution is undermining the well-being of billions of people, especially vulnerable communities who bear the heaviest burden. It is the largest environmental health risk in the world, responsible for 6 million premature deaths a year, more than HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. From cars to power plants, many of the same air pollutants that damage our lungs damage our climate. Rapidly urbanizing regions in developing countries are on the front lines of this global health and climate crisis. Urgent action is needed to identify and accelerate solutions. The U.S. Agency for International Development is launching a bold initiative to improve air quality in cities around the world. The Clean Air Catalyst program is a partnership with the World Resources Institute, Environmental Defense Fund, and a global consortium that is developing local solutions with governments, communities, and the private sector. Starting in 2 pilot cities, Indore, India, and Jakarta, Indonesia. Reducing air pollutants improves public health, reduces poverty and inequality, and lessens climate change impacts. From advancing clean energy access, to developing alternatives to burning crops, to supporting the transition to zero-emission transportation, Clean Air Catalyst is developing solutions on the ground and in the air, because everybody deserves the right to breathe clean air.
Air pollution remains Ghana's #1 environmental risk to public health. In the Greater Accra region, major sources of air pollution include industrial sites, vehicular movements, waste sites, and domestic activities. To support the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in the fight against air pollution, the Pollution Management and Environmental Health Program was initiated with support from the World Bank.
The World Bank, through the Pollution Management and Environmental Health Program, has really impacted positively on the functions of EPA, particularly in the areas of skills development, that's capacity building.
The World Bank project has helped the EPA to come out with the air quality management plan. Well, it's supposed to be a guide for all of us in our interventions within the city center.
With this new state-of-the-art equipment that we have, we're able to get minute by minute and continuous data, which is more reliable and more accurate.
We now have a database that describes the air quality situation in the country. So it makes it easier for decision makers with that information to be able to come out with policies to combat air pollution.
I have been doing some work in air pollution health, and the difficulty always has been how to get the message down to people who need information. So this program helped me to get the actual language to transfer the results to the layperson on the streets.
Key outcomes of the project include improved capacity, improved data monitoring, and enhanced analytical work for air pollution management.
There's a sense of urgency here. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves, and we at the World Bank, we are very much concerned and very much into supporting Ghana.
The public should be aware that there's a crisis of air quality in our country, and that we should desist from actions that results in air pollution.
Let us avoid activities that promote indoor air pollution, and let us also avoid staying in polluted areas out there.
Let's stop polluting the environment. Let's stop polluting the air, get quality air, and to prolong our life. That is the best way we can also ensure posterity and sustainability.